Oh, no.
Okay, perfect. So, thank you so much for joining me today for the How We Remember Indigenous Archive project. So, this is something I haven't been doing, but I'm also going to say the date and time because I realize I need to say that. So, it is September 21st, 2023, and it is currently 3:51 p.m. And Colette has filled out a consent form. So, would you mind stating your name, age, and current occupation?
My name is Colette Denali, Montoya. I'm 40 years old and I am an academic librarian, archivist, and oral historian. And I affirm that I filled out my consent form.
Yes, thank you. So to begin, would you mind telling me your Indigenous background and where you grew up?
So I am enrolled in the Pueblo of Isleta. My mother is 3/4 Isleta and 1/4 from the Pueblo of San Felipe. So I am 3/8 Isleta and 1/8 San Felipe Pueblo. My father is a settler of white settler ancestry, some of which is French and more recent. Like they arrived um, in the just after World War I, and
Mhm.
then the rest of his family are old stock, like British American, who came in the 17th centuries, in the 1600s, to the Northeast. Yeah, I'm
Oh,
at. That's where I'm from.
okay. And so how was your indigeneity a part of your life as a child, and how was the history of your community passed down to you?
Um, my indigeneity as a child. So I was born when my parents were in graduate school. They were both at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. I was born there, and then because of my parents' academic careers, my dad's a professor. My mom has done a lot of adjuncting, and she's largely worked in social policy and public policy. Um, so I moved around quite a bit as a child. But throughout all of it, I always maintained a very strong connection to home, to our communities in New Mexico, and my family there. My grandmother, before I was born, remarried a man from Okeowenge, which at the time in my childhood was called San Juan Pueblo. It's just north of Espanola. So she lived there. And the rest of my mother's siblings are largely scattered around Albuquerque and Santa Fe. She had one sibling who lived in Texas. Um, yeah, so my family is largely like most of them on that side are in New Mexico. And then in my generation, as we've become adults, some of us do live a bit further afield. But I have no memory of a before knowing my home.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
I've always had a strong connection to home, which I love. I love that I know so intimately my community,
Right, right.
even though I've had, I've lived away.
Mhm,
Uh, and I used to, when I was younger, I think of myself as a diasporic person, but the more and more that I think about that term, largely like influenced by the fact that my former spouse is an immigration scholar.
mhm,
Um, I My relationship to that term has changed quite a bit.
mhm. I think that's a really interesting, you know, note you made because I tend to also refer to myself as part of the diaspora, and I know a couple other people, younger people who are like in their 20s or just starting their academic journeys, do the same.
Mhm.
So it is definitely something to think about and to wonder, kind of like, why are we identifying that way? What does it mean?
Sorry. I turned off my notification thing. One second. Let me just turn
Oh,
them off
you're
again.
good. No,
I think like I forgot to do that, like turn off on every device.
it's
Uh,
totally fine.
Thank you. I apologize.
So, is there a specific memory from your childhood, maybe related to a significant person or a practice that sticks out to you?
Quite a bit, and I'm not sure like how familiar you are with Pueblo people, but we are very private about our culture, our beliefs, our ways of doing things. So yeah, I do. I have very specific and strong memories. I'm just like I was trying to think of some that feel more comfortable sharing, and yeah, I think for me it was just such a part of everyday life,
Mhm,
even living away, that I never really questioned my identity as a Pueblo person. There was a time when I was quite young, the first or second grade, when I came to understand that I was Indian. And
mhm,
also like this was in the 1980s, so the terminology was a little bit different. And it
Mhm.
has definitely like, fluctuates and between communities and temporally. But I knew I was Pueblo. I knew I was from Isleta. I knew I was from San Felipe. I did not fully understand that I was Indian. For me, like my idea of Indian was very colored by just like mainstream American media.
Mhm.
And when I had that realization that those identities overlapped, I remember like, oh, that doesn't make any sense. Like we don't look like this like stereotypical archetype at all.
Right.
We don't have like I mean the horses are there and even our hairstyles like are different, right? So I remember experiencing some confusion, but a lot of my earliest memories of home and of indigeneity are very place specific. Like I remember being at feast days. I remember being like on the plaza and watching the dancing at a very, very young age, like to the point where, those very, very early memories where you can't, it's just kind of more like a vignette and less of a
Right.
memory.
Almost like a feeling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I remember placing my hands in the sand and like seeing the outlines of my hands and then looking at my family next to me and their hands and thinking about how like my skin is so much lighter. And at the time, like I was so young that it didn't really trigger any kind of deeper thought.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, as time went on, I definitely, especially as an elementary schooler living in Wisconsin, um, came to understand my sense of indigeneity and the sense of and as juxtaposed with the local indigenous communities, because a lot of like most of my indigenous peers that I encountered in Wisconsin were Oneida or Menominee, and then later in college Ho-Chunk and Ojibwe. Yeah, I guess like I had a lot of what now might be called microaggressions or bordering on just like a racist experiences as an elementary
Mhm.
schooler. But I was young enough that while I found them profoundly disturbing, I don't think I completely understood
Mhm.
how harmful they were until I was much older.
Right.
Uh,
Right.
and there's two in particular that stick out again from my first grade. So I didn't go to kindergarten; I skipped kindergarten. That was my first time in like a school, although I'd gone to Montessori school as a young child before elementary. But that fall of my first grade year, um, the high school that was like for the same district as my elementary school had homecoming parade, and the team they were playing was the Indians, and they had a float where they had like an effigy of a native person, and I don't remember if it was like in a noose or in flames or something, but I found it very upsetting. And there were all kinds of signs like kill the Indians, scalp the Indians, and this is
Yeah.
1988, so like I feel like people should have known better, but also I was 5, so I,
Right. Right.
I don't think I had a lot of context, or like I just
Mhm.
found it disturbing, and I told my mother, who was quite upset, and I believe like she wrote to the local paper and did contact the school board.
Yeah. No, that I mean that's just I mean not only would that be horrible for an adult, but especially for a kid when you're still trying to figure out who you are and where you are and like how you fit in the rest of everyone. To see something like that is just not great.
It's very
Um
strange. Do you mind if I tell you about the other incident, which
no,
was
go
also
ahead. Yeah, I was gonna say that was gonna ask. That's the next
the
question anyway.
okay. So the second incident, like that really sticks out to me from elementary school. And I actually have a photo of this that I should email you later, but I had, as many, elementary schools do, like the Thanksgiving celebration. I don't remember like exactly the context of what we were doing, but people were in class. We were making like construction paper, like pilgrim hats with a buckle,
Mhm.
and I think like the little white collar. And like because I was quite young, like I don't think I really like I didn't know the story of Thanksgiving. And I actually remember like when I first started talking to my mom about this, like that day I completely conflated Columbus and the Pilgrims. Like and I was really confused. I was like, I don't there were three boats that like it was taught very poorly, like whatever was conveyed to the class. But we're supposed to make these hats and collars and belt buckles, and my teacher wouldn't let me. She's like, you're an Indian, you need to make an Indian vest and a headdress. And I just remember the feeling of being different,
Mhm.
and also the feeling of like, but like at home we don't wear like headdresses and vests, so I like didn't really know what I was supposed to do.
Right.
And I did the best I could, and just remember feeling different.
Mhm.
very different. And, now, like, of course I have much more, like, I can evaluate that incident
Right,
differently.
right.
But as a little girl, I think I was 6.
Yeah.
Definitely just like, I just remember the feeling of being like, oh, I'm different. And I already, like, this is Green Bay, Wisconsin, a suburb of Green Bay in the 80s. I remember there were twin Asian American boys in my class in first grade, but they ended up skipping a grade, and I don't remember the next time I had a classmate of color, until I switched schools in middle school. And it was really it's isolating.
Mhm.
I remember there was a girl in another class when I was in 3rd grade who was Hmong, and a lot of Hmong community members in northeastern Wisconsin. They were Hmong community members were brought over, often sponsored by Lutheran churches, just after the Vietnam War. But I don't really remember meeting other, like, Native kids who were local very often. When I was between the summer between 2nd and 3rd grade, I think I did, like, one of those summer programs at the university at UWGB. And the one I chose was Oregon Trail.
Mhm.
And I chose it because it sounded fun to me. I don't think I knew what the Oregon Trail was. Like, we basically, like, it was a group of kids, and we, like, decorated, like, little red wagons, like prairie schooners, and, like, pulled them around campus. And they were, like, the teachers had, like, set up, like, different parts of campus each day to be a different stop on the Oregon Trail, and we talk about it. And we never talked about Indigenous people at all. I have no memory of that at all. But the last day of camp, there was, like, a party, and, like, people, you could bring your parents. And it turned out that one of the girls in my class was Oneida, was Indigenous, and she came wearing regalia, and I had no idea that she was Native.
Mhm.
Like, even as, like, a little girl, 6, 7 years old, I had no concept of the diversity of appearance
Mhm. Right.
among Indigenous peoples. And to me, I just remember being like, wait, but she's, like, looks white to me, like, or, I don't know if I would even know the term white. It was so white where I lived. It just, like, it completely baffled me. I did not get it. I
Right.
don't
Right.
remember, like, if I talked to anyone about it, or if anyone, like, tried to explain that to me. Made no sense
Right.
to me at the time. And
Having
then
this, yeah, just sort of having you know, wanting to be like knowing that your community or indigenous peoples can look different, have different skin tones and everything, but at the same time as a child being told that there's one way indigenous people look, and
for
not
sure,
understanding.
yeah.
Um
And community, like, I'm Pueblo, and
mhm,
our community is not we don't have as much admixture as communities in the Midwest or Northeast. So for me, like, pretty much my entire family looked like a stereotypical Indian, as I would have used the term back then.
mhm, mhm.
And it
So
was just
then,
very jarring.
yeah, I was going to ask then, knowing your experiences from childhood, like elementary school into middle school, did your relationship with your indigeneity and your identity change as you entered high school and teenage years?
Yes, I was very fortunate. For every summer, from beginning as a rising 8th grader on, to go to residential camps, like on campus camps through ACES, American Indian Science and Engineering Society. And every summer, the camp would be in a different campus. And so, like, when I was a rising 8th grader, it was in Wisconsin. And then the following year, I was in Seattle, and then Iowa. And then one of them was in New York, upstate New York. And that cohort, many of us continued throughout the entire program. And we'd see each other every summer for multiple weeks. And I think each year the program got a little longer, until, like, when we were about to finish high school, it was several weeks. And each camp had a different theme having to do with science. And I remember feeling really unsure of myself the first year. Like,
Mhm,
I felt at home with my family
mhm,
and in my community when I'd be home in New Mexico. But in terms of, like, what does it mean to be Indigenous when I'm not at home, that I had no experience parsing out until I started going to camp. And with this camp, like there would usually be like 40 kids. I would say about 40. And I have so many photos from it. I'm very fortunate that like just my own daily practices of letter writing that I got from my settler grandma. I kept in touch with so many people, and many of us are still friends and like see each other. Even though our first camp we met was the summer of 1995.
That's amazing.
I know, so we've known each other a very long time. Most of my life at this point. But yeah, at those camps, I met Native kids who looked all different from each other. I remember being very struck that first summer by all the Lumbee kids because I had never encountered anyone Afro-Indigenous. And it had never occurred to me, even at like 12 years old, that those identities could overlap. I also had never heard I guess like I don't even know if I knew what a federally recognized tribe was. Like it just like wasn't on my radar. But I learned from the Lumbee kids about like what state versus federal recognition means. I remember thinking it was really strange, particularly, I think a lot of my dissonance was with the Lumbee students. Because most of the other students were from like the Midwest or the Southwest, right?
Right.
So like I had experience with those like cultural regions at least. But the Lumbee kids, most of the kids at camp were Baptist Christians and very open about sharing about their faith. And I remember thinking like this is very baffling to me. And I was raised atheist. I think like my settler father, he comes from a long line of secular humanists. I was raised without, in terms of like European religion, I was raised without a religion. And while later, like I came to understand my community's relationship with Catholicism as a young person, I was very much parroting what I was taught by my father and his side of the family, which was that like people who follow religions, particularly Christianity, are doing so because they're like their minds are too weak to make decisions for themselves, and they need some kind of comfort because they're not smart enough to handle the world on their own. Which of course now I look back and I'm like, I was saying like repeating these kind of lines to my peers. It must have been so hurtful to them. But I came to really grapple with that later. But like as a young person, I do have a lot of like, oh, I can't believe I said that kind of thing to like my classmates who I'm sure already felt like othered by the fact that like for many of us, not just myself, like it's their first time encountering Afro-Indigenous people, and just being like, huh. I didn't know that could happen. Which I mean, obviously it makes so much sense, right? But I had no idea.
Right. Well, when you haven't been, exposed to that or really thought about it, it's surprising. Or to think of, I think especially in the United States, there's this really big belief in like you're really only one thing. Like you're Indigenous, you're Black, you're white, or you're just mixed. I feel like having very prominent identities or like overlapping identities is still kind of a struggle for a lot of Americans, I think.
I think it was for me as well. Like I've talked about in some of my other talks about like how I thought like as I was coming out to myself as a young person that I couldn't possibly be gay. I was going to be okay. Like I wasn't gay because I'm already Native, and that you could only have like one other thing.
Right.
And the way I thought of it was, like in school, like you never had like two specials. We called them like music or gym or art in the same day. You could only have one special at a time. And that was like, okay, my special is that I'm Pueblo. So I'm okay. I'm just like, maybe I just don't like boys yet.
Right.
And I could like kind of in my interior self, like push down this like nascent attraction to girls because I mean, I was a kid. It wasn't like sexy.
Right.
But I just like I didn't get it. Like I just didn't like boys, and like all my peers like in middle school, when it kind of really kicks off, they were just like boy crazy. Many of them, not all of them. And I was just I don't see it. Like I just like I don't feel anything special toward boys at all.
Right.
So I thought I was just like broken, and I was just like, okay, since I'm already Native, like it's gonna be okay. I just have to wait. It just like hasn't happened yet. And I remember like reading like Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, and how they're all like, like everyone gets their period at like a different time. You never know what's gonna happen. I was like, okay, that makes sense. Like I'll start liking boys at some point, and it's I'll never know what's gonna happen. It still hasn't happened, but
right. Um And so that is something like interesting that I also want to talk about was um, how was it navigating before you knew maybe it was identity? How was it navigating though, you know, um, being attracted to women, being a lesbian, and then also grappling with your indigeneity as a teenager? Because I know as a child that's difficult to pin down, but maybe as a teenager and into adulthood.
Oh, it's kind of funny because I think a lot of my like there was always like these moments like these catalyst moments where you're just like, oh, something shifts and you understand it
Mhm,
differently. Um, and for me, like I started to have these kind of like romantic dreams about Jodie Foster as an elementary schooler. That was kind of like the first hint, right?
mhm,
Um, but then as middle school wore on, like I had like big, what are now very obvious to me as that they're crushes, but I
mhm,
had like feelings or like something special like that I would feel about one of my classmates, and then another one of my classmates when I switched schools. And I would just like to be near them. I loved when I would like pass them in the hallway. I'd get all giddy, but like because I had no real familiarity with queerness, which like the term that wasn't a term that was really used in the early 90s, that I grew up hearing, even in a negative way. I just like didn't know it.
mhm,
Um, I just like didn't know what it was. I was just like, oh, I guess I just like really admire them.
mhm,
Like I like them, but I was like, but I don't want to be like them. I just like it didn't make sense to me.
mhm,
And I do have I have an uncle. My late uncle was gay, and
mhm,
he was actually like a close friend of my father when he was an undergrad.
mhm.
He lived in Washington, D.C. with his partner. My mother and I, I grew up around them. I never clocked that he was gay because I didn't really know what that was really um, until I was 8, and my mom took me to Washington, D.C. She had a conference, like a math conference, and I stayed with my uncles. Um, and I asked them, like, why do you sleep in the same bed? Like, you guys, why do you have to share a bed? Like, it seemed kind of like, why would you do that? And I don't remember which one, my Uncle David or Uncle John Franco, they said, but we really like to cuddle. Like, we
Right.
love to cuddle with each other. We just like love it. And that made so much sense to me.
Mhm,
And like
mhm.
that was like that moment really sticks out in my mind. Like, oh, okay, so when you're gay, it can just mean that you just like really just want to cuddle with like someone who shares your gender identity. Or I never would have used that term at that time, right? Um, but then I had really catalyzing like year in early high school. I lived in Ukraine in high school with my father. He had a Fulbright fellowship. He was studying Soviet dissident literature and teaching at a school in Eastern Ukraine. And this school, like it started in like preschool, and you could go all the way up to PhD. And I went to the
Wow.
Lyceum, which is like the high school, and my father taught at the university level. But I started that year, that in that time period, that particular year, when I was there, I spent a lot of time alone in the first time, like the first period of adjustment. It
Mhm.
was winter when we arrived. It was very cold. And I had been living in Wisconsin, but even so, like Eastern Ukraine was something new. I remember like the hairs inside my nostrils freezing.
My
And if
gosh.
I touched my nose, like sometimes I would get cut because everything was
Oh,
frozen. Or my
yeah.
eyelashes would freeze, or like I really like I could not figure out how to keep my glasses from fogging up. Like it was so I stayed inside a lot because it was just too hard.
Yeah.
My Russian wasn't very good at that time. I like spoke very minimal Russian when I arrived. So I spent a lot of time alone at home. And I remember looking at this like Rolling Stone magazine with Fiona Apple on the front, and her hair was like splayed out. I was like, oh my God, she's so beautiful. Oh my God. And then all of a sudden it hit me. I was like, oh my God, that probably means I'm gay.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden, like if it felt like it was everywhere, like that confirmation bias is everywhere. For
Right,
my
right.
15th birthday, like my dad and I went to Amsterdam, and I remember going to the Van Gogh Museum, and there was like a special exhibit on Paul Gauguin, who like paints all of these like Polynesian women, like
Mhm.
many of them naked and just, and I loved that. I loved it so much. And I always had loved Gauguin for that reason. But all of a sudden I was like, oh no. Like, and walking through that show at the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam and being like, what if people can tell by how long I'm spending in this room? I better make sure I don't look too fast. And,
Mhm, mhm.
all of a sudden I was very self-conscious about it. Came to know much later in my life that Gauguin was like a gross pedophile, and these are all like 12-year-old girls essentially that one of them that like married and
Mhm.
had like abandoned his family.
Mhm.
Um, but at the time, I thought it was so beautiful. I had never seen um naked women, like women's bodies that looked like me.
Right, right.
It was really profound, especially at a time in my life when I was living in Eastern Europe, and I saw so few people who looked like me,
Mhm.
other than Roma folks, and I often um people would clock me as Romani,
Mhm.
um, just like in the metro or whatever. And I remember feeling really indignant about it because, of course, like the Roma population there is so stigmatized,
Mhm. Mhm.
and I didn't have the context. Like I didn't have the context and understanding of like why I felt that revulsion when people thought I was Romani.
Mhm.
I'm not, I would get really defensive. But
Mhm.
that was really about that time period of living in Ukraine in high school. I think often when you're removed from your environment, that's when you can see things about home much more clearly.
Right, right.
And I started to understand more the way that other folks think of Native people, and not just in the US. I spent a lot of time in Germany. My father's professor of German. And when I was in Germany with him as an elementary schooler, I remember going to get Playmobil, like a big sense of Playmobil. And I got like the Indians. My dad got me the Indians, I think, because he thought like, oh, my kid is native, she'll like this. And now when I look at them, that particular set, like I still have it.
Mhm.
It's so weird. There's like a teepee, but there's also the child has like a kachina. There's a totem pole. There's like the grandma's like weaving a rug on a Navajo loom, and this is like all in the same set. It makes no
Right.
sense. There's a canoe, birch bark canoe. Like
Just
it
mashed
makes no
together.
sense. But also just like I still was having so much dissonance over. Okay, so I'm Pueblo. I know what I feel like I have a general handle on being Pueblo and what that means, and like our ways of doing our doings and our clothing and our food. It doesn't align even like a very, very little alignment with like this mainstream stereotype of what an Indian is, especially in Germany and Ukraine.
Mhm.
People were very confused by me. I mean, I don't, or they at least they expressed that to me. In Ukraine, that just like how you don't look like your dad, or like you look like your dad, right? But you're like darker, and like there's something,
Right. Like
this
not quite.
right, like they did, but because also there's no like it just like would never occur to someone in the mid late 1990s in Ukraine, like, oh, our classmate is indigenous.
Right, right.
It just like didn't occur to them. And yeah, so I started to really hone my internal sense of identity living in Ukraine in high school. I think a lot of it was healthy. I was very fortunate that I had like this kind of space where I was definitely, I was like on the outside, like especially in the beginning when I couldn't really speak Russian.
Mhm.
Um, where I was just like living so internally, and that's such a big time, like a time of flux for most people, like when they're a young adolescent.
Right. I mean, I feel like teenage years are more confusing and difficult enough, and so then you add being in a different country and there's no one that looks like you. I mean, I feel like that would be such a difficult and also very transformative time.
It was
Um,
powerful.
yeah, and I had never really considered, which I think it's so great that you brought up, maybe other like nations' perspectives on, indigenous people. Was there a lot of like, so any representation in media, or just like a confusion across classmates, or just general public not understanding?
I don't know if I ever saw media at that age, like of that time in Ukraine. Um, I do remember that people didn't know the word like Indiansky or I was Indianskaya. Um,
Mhm.
but yeah, I don't remember ever like really seeing anything depicted, but people definitely knew what it was.
Hmm.
I don't know like how. I'm like not totally sure because I was I wasn't like acculturated as a young
Mhm.
person there. Um, People were often very interested.
Mhm.
They were like, "Oh, how do you say my name in Indian?" That kind of thing. But it was even
Okay.
more removed when folks would say that back in the US because it's like Ukraine. Um,
Right.
And my grandmother, my father and I went to Crimea for vacation, and there's they're Crimean Tatars, so they're Muslim, Muslim community, and we were spending time in like Bakhchisarai. So it's a community with of Crimean Tatars who are I think primarily Muslim. I was at that point because remember the Soviet Union had not ended that long ago, so there was definitely kind of like a state of flux in terms of religion and spirituality.
Right.
But I remember like we went to Bakhchisarai, and it's got like this like I don't know, there's a mosque and like kind of a historical site / tourist trap. There's a harem they call the Garem. I actually don't know that much about it, so I'm like I don't want to describe it in a way that's like not appropriate. But what I had heard at that time, it was the harem, and then there's a fountain in there, a beautiful fountain, and apparently that was the fountain in Pushkin's famous poem, "The Fountain of Bakhchisarai," which I learned in at school. But I remember being encouraged by people at that spot because they had like a dress up in the harem clothing and get your photo taken situation. They're like, "Oh, you're perfect for it, right? You'd be so perfect." And I remember feeling weird, and we didn't do it. And I can't know if it was because like too expensive or like I don't remember. But I do remember like that being like, "Oh yeah, you would look so great in like the harem clothing," because you're like insinuation being because I'm brown. Yeah. But I came back to the US for college.
Yes, so that was going to be
Sorry.
No, you're good.
It's like I turned off all the notifications. Hang on, why does it still say do not disturb is on? Oh, because it's my partner and I have her on like an override.
Oh yeah, and that's totally no problem.
Hang on, let me just tell her. I apologize.
No, you're totally fine. These are not like super formal anyway, so like
No,
I've had people
okay.
need to take a call and stuff. That's totally fine.
Okay, sorry.
No problem.
I turned it off and I was like, oh yeah, it's because Vanessa.
That makes sense. Yeah.
He overrides all do not disturb just in case.
Yes, in case of emergency. I'm pretty sure I have like my mom on that as well, like just in case.
Yeah. But yeah, let's keep going.
Yeah, so the next question was going to be because then you were talking about you came back to the US for college. So
No, I wanted to tell you my very last high school camp experience.
Okay.
So the last summer of ACES camp, the rising senior, and I think you could go the summer after senior, but I didn't. This was at a university, private university in upstate New York. And part of the program that was different than other years is we had like a group time in the evening, and there was like a facilitator. I don't know if he was a therapist or like just a community member. He was non-native. And we would just talk about issues. Like we did that, that like exercise they sometimes have kids do where they have like the teddy bear and you have to pretend it's a baby and take care of it for a week so that we don't like get pregnant. That kind of thing. It was like that kind of thing. And part of it was just that we left like we all have like a little mailbox and you could leave each other. I think we called them like warm fuzzies or something. Right? Like leave each other notes. That was like part of it. And this was like in a big room in the building, the dorm building where we stayed. And the girls were like on one wing and the boys on the other. And he said this facilitator said something that made me really uncomfortable because at this point I was already like I understood myself as gay and I don't think I had told anyone at camp.
Right.
But because he said that, it made me really uncomfortable, and I did tell some friends. And they were like they asked me like so mature of them at that age, right? What I wanted to do about it. And I was like, I think, and eventually like I came to understand, like I wanted to talk to the facilitator and tell him that I had been hurt, that he had like made this, it wasn't necessarily homophobic, it was just weird. I don't remember what the comment was, but I remember being like, ugh, it made me feel uncomfortable. And so I came out to him. I told this facilitator, like, oh, like I'm gay. I don't know what word I used then.
Hmm.
And like that really upset me.
Hmm.
And he seemed receptive. I didn't think anything of it. And then like the next time we had the big group, we were like all going around circles, sharing like our high and our low, or that kind of thing they do in that kind of setting. And I learned recently that that there's someone in our group who is gay. And he's like, if that person feels like they want to stand up and share, I encourage you to do so. We'd all love to hear from you. And I didn't move. I didn't do anything because I was like, oh, this is so like, what? And then one of the boys stood up. One of the Lumbee boys, he stood up as a joke. And he's very masculine, like in the way that like high school boys are like defining a masculinity, right? Hyper masculine posturing. And he's like, oh, I'm gay, ha. And like, a bunch of people laughed, a bunch of people were uncomfortable. And then he sat down and like the moment could have passed. And then I stood and I was like, no, it's me. I'm the one who's gay. And I remember, I just remember the quiet in that moment. And then the next day, like a lot of my peers, because we'd all known each other for several years at this point, left me warm fuzzies. But there were three friends I had that summer who were just like so caring and loving in that moment and in that time, because I think like we still had a few weeks to go left of our time there.
Right.
I felt like I completely lost faith in that facilitator. I don't remember their name. I hated being in that space, that circle space, because
Yeah.
I was suddenly aware that like, what if there were other things we were talking about that that other people had experienced that I just I wasn't aware of because I just didn't know.
Right. And I mean, one, that was like exceptionally brave of you to stand up, because I think it's for an adult to put someone in that position, or anyone in that position, but but to put someone who you're supposed to be like guiding and like some sort of like supervisor, facilitator, and then to put someone out like that, I feel like it's just so irresponsible, and it kind of feels intentional.
It was. I mean, obviously,
Yeah.
but
Right.
it felt so strange because I was like, wait, what? Because this is 1998.
Okay. Yeah.
So like Ellen had come out the previous year. It wasn't like gay people were very much a joke. They did come up, like the Birdcage movie had come out with Robin Williams, and everything was just like very campy and funny. And if lesbians were talked about, it was the opposite. They were like depressing or kind of dour, or like thought of as ugly, right? Because I think our main imagery of lesbians was Ellen DeGeneres, who was at that time dating Anne Heche, Katie Lang, and Melissa Etheridge. I don't think I ever really saw a queer person of color that I was aware of being queer at that age.
Right.
And then after that, I had my senior year of high school. I started really kind of reckoning with the way my identities intersected. I now understood you could be both, right? My parents got divorced that year. I ended up skipping the last year of high school for a lot of reasons, right? One being that like my schooling in Ukraine was more accelerated, and when I came back to the US, like it was kind of boring, especially because I had like kind of gotten accustomed to the challenge of like going to school and like living in another country and living in another world where like my mind was just much more engaged on a daily basis. And suddenly I'm like back in the US, and it just seemed kind of like boring. And I was really depressed, like dealing with my parents' divorce and some of like the associated like fallout in our family.
Right.
And I had also been very independent when we lived in Ukraine. My father was teaching. It was just the two of us. I had like a nanny kind of neighbor figure, Olga, who like, she was in and out. She didn't live with us. And then now all of a sudden I'm a child again, right? Like I have my mom and I'm supposed to like listen to her. And like, I had been like myself, like I hadn't had like an authority relationship for a while. So,
Oh, right.
but it was in that context that I was trying to grapple with these two identities. What did it mean to be both? And especially since neither one was really normative at the time. Now I think like my identity and even like my profession, all of it. Like I think it fits together really beautifully. But at 15, 16 years old, it was very fraught,
Yeah. And
very fraught.
adding so many different, personal difficulties. Again, adding not only the struggles with identities, but also, divorce or just getting through school and exams and friends and all the already difficult things that are in a young adult's life. And so as you moved into college, as you became an adult, how has your Indigenous identity and your relationship with your community developed and changed? So kind of like where you're at now, sort of thing.
It's so funny, like if I think back to undergrad, it has been on my mind a bit recently, for two reasons. So I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I was very fortunate. After my family experienced some financial difficulty after my parents divorced, so my college plans had to change. I was originally intending to go to Smith College in Massachusetts, and my paternal grandmother, who I lived with when I was young, very young, I don't know if she'd retired yet at that point or not, but she and her husband, my step grandfather, my grandpa Alan, were both professors at UMass Amherst. So it just seemed like great. And like I felt like at that time, like Smith College was just like the nexus of lesbianism, right? I was
Hmm.
like, okay, that's where I want to go. But financially it wasn't feasible at that time. Like this is the late 90s. Now I know like a lot of private schools will cover like everything but your like expected parental contribution. But at that time it was not the case. I was fortunate to get a full scholarship um, as a chancellor's scholar
Hmm.
at the University of Wisconsin. It's a program for students of color, and it paid for our tuition and books. And then I had a grant from the Wisconsin Indian Education Association that paid for my dorm. Like I graduated with no debt, and I never had to pay anything other than just like what I want, what fun money and stuff, right?
Right, right.
Travel back and forth because at this point, like my mother and my siblings, my mother and my siblings lived in New Mexico.
Hmm.
Um, and my father was in Wisconsin with his new wife, but I did not want to see him, and he didn't want to see me, so we didn't really have a relationship. But
Hmm.
I moved into my dorm the very first day, and there was like a little gift basket on my desk, and it was from the multicultural like student because they were what to call them. They were basically like a dorm RAs who worked specifically with students of color, and they had left me this like little welcome basket. And I was like, oh, that's cute. But then like my roommate, who's white, was just like, hey, why didn't I get one? Like, and it caused some like weird tension between us, even though we knew each other. We were, already. And I remember being like, that's weird. And I also kept getting emails from these the MRCs, they're called multicultural resident consultants. I think, yeah. So the MRCs would send out these emails about like what was happening on campus for students of color. And Wisconsin is a huge campus. I mean, I think there were 40,000 undergrads and grad students at the time
Wow. Okay.
it was huge. And at that time, I just remember being like, everything felt so dissonant, right? My parents had
Hmm.
just gotten divorced. I'm
Hmm.
like I don't understand where I fit in anywhere. I did go to a couple of meetings for like Native students. They have a great organization called Wangshik. And then there was an ACES chapter there too, but I wasn't in science. I
Hmm.
studied anthropology and religious studies later.
Hmm.
Um, but in Wangshik, it felt like I was at the time the only Southwest student. And it felt like all of the like cultural things they were doing, which makes sense, were about like the Midwest. And
Hmm.
I just didn't relate. And also just like they were all straight. And because I was like normalizing my identity within myself, I was like, oh, I don't want to hang out with these straight people. And again, there was the internal prejudice against the Native people who to me didn't look Native.
Right, right,
And even though at the time, like I was even aware of it. I
right,
just
right.
feel the difference and that like this was this Native group, like I just didn't belong.
Hmm.
I went to school for 2 years because I started undergrad at 16. I was too young. I was the number one drinking school in the country.
Wow. Yeah.
Um, there was so much focus on drinking and then on football. It's
Mm-hmm.
a Big Ten school. I had no interest in either.
Yeah.
And I became very, very depressed over the course of my first 3 semesters. And finally, like in my second semester of my sophomore year, I stepped out.
Hmm.
I went home to New Mexico and I went back. I stayed home for about 2 years. And then I went back. And when I went back, I felt I was much more prepared. At that point, I was 19 and I turned 20 that semester I went back. But it was too much. It was too
Yeah.
much to be like 16 years old I was just too young, like developmentally too young.
Right, right. And to be
And
surrounded by
drunk football
I
fans.
was gonna say like an things that you don't like and just it's overwhelming for, someone who's 18 and up, but to come in 16 and again, with all of life's hardships going on, I could see how that was overwhelming.
Weird. It's really weird. But when I went back to New Mexico. I lived at home. I lived in my community.
Mhm.
I had a partner. I mean, although like I was so young, I didn't say partner, right?
Right, right.
And I really those 2 years were really good for me. They were really healing in a lot of ways. The fall before I went back to college, so fall 2002. My partner and I at the time moved to Minneapolis, St. Paul. We moved to St. Paul to stay with their family.
Mhm.
And we broke up after a couple of months, and I ended up that was a catalyst, like that was like no early November, or like yeah, and I was like, oh my gosh, like what am I doing? What do I want to do? I don't actually know.
Right.
I decided I didn't want to go home
Mhm.
because like my mom, like just like living at home, it was hard. We didn't live in Albuquerque. It was like I couldn't drive because I had like gone the year I would have went to drive, I was already in college and I lived in
Right,
my
right.
college years, so why would I have learned?
Mhm.
So I was just kind of like always stuck at home and like we had dial-up internet. Like it was just isolating. I didn't want to go back. So I decided to go back to school.
Mhm.
And at that point I was like the target age. And
Mhm.
my idea of what I wanted to do had definitely pivoted. I had
Right.
always like as in my first 2 years, I didn't really know. Like I was undeclared. I think I declared an anthro major my sophomore year, but I didn't like know what I wanted to do. I was like, and now it makes sense. I was a child.
I mean, right. Like how would you have how would you have known?
Yeah, yeah. How would I have known? Like, but at the time, I remember being like my scholarship because there was a lot of like, really. It's kind of like they pick the cream of the crop because they want to be able to say,
Right, right.
like this scholarship, like they accept the best students, and then they can say like, our program made such a big difference, but they were very selective about who got into the program in the first place. And
Mhm.
and when I came back, I started the American Indian Studies program, and there wasn't a major at the time; it was a minor.
Right.
I met Professor Ada Deer, and she was the chair at the time, and she was amazing. I remember just like loving going to her office just to talk to her.
Mhm.
Um, and it's so funny because at the time she was like a professor, and then like as like the remainder of my undergraduate career went on, I learned more and more about her. That she was, she's Menominee. Her tribe was terminated in the 1950s, and she was part of the coalition of women who fought, and they were rewarded their federal recognition in the 70s.
Mhm. Mhm.
She went to UW-Madison just like I was as an undergrad. She ended
Right.
up going to Columbia School of Social Work. And then in the early night, she ran for Congress. She didn't win, but she was the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the early 90s, which at that point was like 7, 8 years earlier that
Right,
she had
right.
that post. But like because she didn't talk about it, she was very modest.
Mhm.
And most of the other professors in that department were not Native.
Mhm.
I did work with Professor Ned Blackhawk, whom I really admired, and I had met before because he had actually been my camp counselor at one of the Native summer camps.
Okay,
The
yeah.
summer I was 13. So like I already had a relationship with him. I took his courses on American Indian history,
Mhm.
and suddenly things made much more sense. It was fantastic to have this course from Ned that like talked about the way that different parts of different communities on Turtle Island experience colonialism differently because of when they experienced European contact and also who they were contacted by.
Mhm. Mhm.
So like in Wisconsin, a lot of the discourse was about like the French fur traders. They're there for the fur trade. And then, in the Northeast, the British. But where
Right.
I come from, we were colonized by the Spanish. I have a Spanish last name.
Mhm.
And people would always be like, wait, I thought you were Latina because of my last name.
Mm.
And even like almost daily, I encounter people who try to speak to me in Spanish and ask for directions. And I understand they're trying to find someone who looks familiar, who's not going to who's going to help them. But at the time, I was like really resentful of it.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, but that was a really important time for me to kind of think about myself in a larger historical context and not just as like, oh, I'm Pueblo and like these other native people are like not, and I don't know what that means, which is I had
Right, right.
experience in the first like 2 years. And then my
Mhm.
last couple years of college, just like I was like, oh, I understand myself very differently. And a lot of that is because of Ned Blackhawk and Professor Deere.
Right. It's
And,
actually Oh, no, go ahead. I didn't mean to
no,
cut
no,
you
no.
off. It was funny that you mentioned Professor Blackhawk because as part of my readings, I just started reading The Rediscovery of America.
Oh, his new book, yeah.
Yes, yeah. And so and apparently he has so many others. It was my first time discovering him. And even my own professor was like, yeah, no, he's
He's
huge in the
brilliant.
community.
He's absolutely brilliant. But and
That's yeah.
he's very but he's also a very gentle person and
Mhm,
is and what I witnessed like as his student in undergrad was his ability to teach to the group of like 5 or 6 extremely eager native kids in the front row,
mhm,
but also to understand how to teach to the non-native kids and to do that at the same time in the same lecture.
mhm.
I can't imagine what a challenge that is. Like even if I think about what I do, and I don't lecture, right?
Right, right.
How to navigate that kind of space. Brilliant.
Yeah.
When I was in undergrad, he published his book, like Violence in the Land, the one about the American
Yes,
West.
yeah.
And he thanked those of us who were in that class, and I was thanked in the acknowledgments. And I didn't know because the following year, like I went, the National Museum of the American Indian opened and Wangshik, the student group, we went in vans. We got to go. We got to be there for the opening day.
Wow.
And I remember going to the gift shop, and I just remember like that day was just so overwhelming because everyone from like every single nation was there. There's a parade of nation, all of it, right?
Right.
But I remember finding his book in the gift shop just because like I needed a quiet moment and opening the book, and I didn't know that we had been acknowledged, and it was so cool. I was like, oh
Yeah,
my gosh, like our professor learned from us, which
right.
is such
Like we're
a
here.
silly thing to like really rock, especially since I come from a long line of academics.
Right, right.
But it was really cool to have Ned there, to have Professor Adair. She had this bumper sticker on her door that said Indian time is on time.
Mhm,
And I remember her telling me that this like for better or for worse, we live in this colonial system. And that if I want to make change in whatever field that I was in, because I remember like at the time I was really just trying to figure that out. I was just like 19, 20.
mhm.
Um, that I would have to work to be much stronger at anything than what a white person in my same role would have to do. She's like, you're a woman, you're native. I don't know if I was out to her or not. I don't even remember at that point.
Mm.
But she was like, you have to work really hard to get half as far. She's like,
Right, right,
you have to be aware. Like she's like, it's not fair, but that is the reality.
right, right,
And but also for her to tell me that, but for me to still see how what she had accomplished in her like brilliant career. Um, I think it had way more of an effect on me than I really understood at the time.
right. I mean, she sounds like an amazing inspiration.
She
Um,
really was, and she
yeah.
passed away 5 weeks ago.
Oh my
Um,
gosh, I'm so sorry.
thank you.
I had no
Um,
idea. Yeah.
yeah, and I was also just like, at the time she was just my professor.
Hmm.
And she was amazing. I think I really struggled because a lot of the American Indian Studies courses were cross-listed in anthropology and they were taught by non-native people. I had an experience in one of my anthro classes with a professor who he made this comment. He was actually the chair at the time. He taught a class on like experimental archaeology in the summer session where like you could learn how to do the things that like the ancient people did, right? From like all over all lots of different cultures. And someone like asked, like, because he was like kind of advertising in the class in a different lecture. He like come, tell us about like some of the summer courses. And someone's like, oh, do you like tan leather at all? And he's like, oh, yeah, we do. He's like, but it's always like it's the worst time in the course because like we do it like the way the Native Americans did, and they tanned leather with urine, and it just smelled so bad. He's like, if you ever like thought to yourself, like, why do these old stories always say like Indians are so smelly? He's like, it's because they were literally wearing like urine soaked clothing.
Which is so,
What?
yeah. And what, how can you be teaching then? Like, how can you be, it's just so,
I just remember being like, what?
Yeah, what are you even talking about?
Yeah, and I didn't speak out in that moment. He was the chair, and I was a sophomore, right?
Right.
But I did. There was an American Indian Student Services person,
Mhm,
Aaron Birdbear, and I did tell him.
mhm.
And Aaron advocated for me in the department. I don't really know what happened with that professor, but whenever I passed him in the hallway from that point on, he always looked away. And he had been my advisor.
Mhm. Right.
He was my advisor. And from that point on, like I knew, like I think I had been kind of leaning toward archaeology. It's like I got it. Something has to change.
Yeah. Mhm,
And I took theory the next fall and like fell hook, line, and sinker for oral history. Loved it.
mhm,
Didn't know
mhm,
what I would ever do with it. I didn't return to it until recently.
mhm.
But I just kind of at that point, because of my parents and my grandparents and my dad's side, assumed that I would just be a professor.
Right, right.
I didn't know what, it was just like, that's what you do. You like go to college, go to grad school, then you're a professor.
Mhm,
Not like I didn't know there were other options. I just like, I didn't know what to imagine for myself.
mhm.
But yeah, I felt like, and when I say like, I felt like I was on the outside or like the fringe of this like native student community in undergrad, it has nothing to do with the other native students.
Mhm, mhm.
It's really just that like, I could not reconcile my Pueblo identity with like, the people who are from Wisconsin. And they never made me feel othered. No one
Right,
ever did that, right? I just like I didn't really know how to align these like spaces because I think for a lot of undergrads, like college is also a time like where you're coming into yourself as an adult
right.
and like normalizing, rationalizing all kinds of things. And I could not figure out how to make my queer community because I was in all these queer student groups and then
Mhm.
my native identity and then my like academic identity, I could not figure out what to do. So I just had friends in all these different parts and
Right,
none
right.
overlapped.
Mhm,
But I will say that the one, a few, I mean, there's so many things that I really took away from UW. I mean, both Netta and Professor Deere were really influential. Um, but my understanding of myself as a person of color that had
right.
never been anything I ever thought about. But when at a predominantly white institution, there was such a strong coalition and social bond between students of color in general. And
Mhm.
I don't know if that would have happened if I'd gone to school like in New Mexico or anywhere else. I don't know.
Right.
But I'm very fortunate that like, I was able to have an environment where queer people of color suddenly were my closest friends. But I
Right,
still
right.
have not encountered uh a person who like openly identified as native and
Mhm.
queer at the same time.
Absolutely.
I had a friend who's Afro-Indigenous.
Right.
But also she didn't talk about her indigeneity much.
Mm,
And maybe she did, I just like wasn't ready to hear it. I don't really remember. I knew that she was enrolled. I remember seeing like letters of her tribe like in her dorm and stuff or her apartment.
right.
But at that time, like the I knew her through my queerness. Everything was so compartmentalized.
Right, right. Not overlapping, just one thing at a time kind of thing.
I mean, still, it was just like intersectionality. Of course, it existed. Even the academic term existed. But
Right.
again, I just like didn't. It wasn't. It was that like experience of merging those identities into one space had not happened for me yet.
Mhm. And so now, knowing that, you have your MLIS, you did go through grad school, things like that, um, how has your indigeneity informed the work you're doing now? And how has this impacted how you feel about archiving, libraries, museums, sort of this idea of academia and indigeneity? I know it's
I
a big
think
question.
I know it's huge, right? And I think it's a
Yeah.
question, right? But for me, I feel very, very, very fortunate that the people and relationships I've had and opportunities I've had have allowed me to really explore how to um have a professional and personal life that is celebratory and like yeah, not just acknowledges who I am, but just like celebrates who I am and is very much based on who I am.
Mhm,
I went to grad school here in New York City.
mhm,
One of my professors in like my intro to archives classes, I brought. We're just like it was kind of like one of those like, what do you want to learn about this semester? What are you and blah blah blah, right? Like get to know you. And I tossed out that I was really interested in learning about the process of repatriation.
mhm,
And this professor said, I don't believe in repatriation. those people have not shown that they're capable of caring for these things, right? Artifacts, I think he said. So I think he said they need to stay in museums and other institutions for the safety of the objects. He's like, also when they're returned to people, but he didn't even say return, I forget the term he used, right?
Right.
Then the whole community loses out, because then only those people can see those objects. It was so alienating. And this is
Yeah.
my very first class session in the archives track. And
Yeah, that would have been
I went on to earn that specialization in grad school, but I never forgot that.
yeah.
It was, and the thing was, like, the rest of the class, like, I don't know if it was because we were like all trying to impress the professor, like our second semester of grad school, but they're all like, oh yeah, that makes so much sense. What the heck?
Yeah, no, it doesn't.
But yeah, I finished grad school, and I've been working as an academic librarian.
Mhm.
And I started working at the Lesbian Her Story Archives in grad school. So I started there as an intern. Like, they had sent, an email to the library school student listserv, saying that it was the Lesbian Her Story Archives. They were looking for interns in library school studying archives or libraries who were interested in working with lesbian materials and had a contextual understanding of that community.
Right.
Had a friend who asked me about the archives before, and I'd never gone. At this point, I think I was like, had already been living in New York City for 4 years. And I lived in Queens. So, I mean, going to Brooklyn, it was trendy, but I didn't really go very often.
Mm.
This is like 2011. And I applied for the internship. I had a phone interview when I was at my former wife's great aunt, who, she and her partner, they're nuns.
Mhm.
I was like hiding upstairs, so I didn't have to do this like lesbian interview in front of
Mhm.
women faith. But I did it, and I remember that semester, like, it was really, for me, really disjointed because I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I was doing like just basic cataloging, data entry type stuff.
Mhm.
But the following semester, like just before it started, my internship supervisor told me that one of the archivists there, Maxine Wolf, who now I understand is like a scion of queer activism in New York City. But at the time, who knew, right? I didn't know.
Mhm.
But Maxine wanted to digitize the audio cassette collection, and the archives has about 3,500 audio cassettes, and they have oral histories. There's like radio programs. I mean, it's just a completely beautiful collection. She wanted
Mhm.
someone who liked archival work, but also was interested in developing a workflow and process for digitizing the tapes.
Mhm.
And I was sold.
Yeah.
I met Maxine. I remember it because it was my former wife's birthday,
Mhm.
and she was like, "It's my birthday." I was like, "No, I really need to go. Like, I know, like, I really want to do this." And I went, and Maxine like kind of handed over the reins to me. Like, I think she like understood that at the time, she was in her 70s at the time, I think,
Mhm.
that like young people just kind of are more adept with technology. And I had another
Mhm.
intern who was with me that semester. She stayed for a semester and left, but I'm still working on it, and now I'm the coordinator of that collection. I
Wow.
became a coordinator. So we run by consensus. Called, like, essentially our board members. We're coordinators.
Mhm.
And everything runs by consensus, and it can be fractious.
Mhm.
So lots of different personalities and identities in that group. But I became the coordinator in 2014, so I've been there 3 years, and
Wow.
now
Okay.
I've been there a little over 12 years. And yeah, I think I'm very fortunate to have come into my professional identity
Mhm.
in relationship with the archives.
Right. Right.
To
I
be
think that had been one of the questions, and then you answered him right there of how has your work reflected your own kind of growing up, developing, and your journey. Um,
Yeah, and I work different roles at different campuses in my professional life, because the archives is a volunteer run institution. And that's one of the principles of the archives, is that we don't accept funding, and that the folks who work there are not paid. And of course now, you listened to my interview on
yes.
Montage.
Yeah.
I my beliefs and understandings of that space have like shifted in many ways.
Mhm.
Especially, I think I mentioned in that recording that I feel that not offering any kind of like compensation, it really restricts the pool of people who can volunteer, who are part of the archives, because
Right.
you have to have enough financial privilege
Mhm.
to be able to spend time volunteering as an archivist. It's not a like speedy profession. It takes a lot of training. And even for interns, and I supervise many interns. You have not only have to have the technical skills for whatever project you're working on, you have to know the subject matter that you're working with.
Mhm.
And it takes a long time to develop. And I think that when any institute, when like, with this volunteer idea, I think it's a beautifully idealistic thing to do, because
Right.
you know that the people who are there are doing it out of a very deep love for stewarding the stories of this community. But it definitely limits the pool of who can afford to be doing something like that.
Right. Right.
And now I look at many of our older archivettes, that's what we call ourselves, who are retired and able to commit a lot of time. That's not necessarily true for my generation, being able to retire in your early 60s.
Right. Right.
And even less so for people with intersecting identities. So that include like racialized groups.
Mhm.
I'm very fortunate that I had a spouse who understood how important it was to me
Mhm.
to be there, even though like it took over an hour on the train to get there. And when my first years of working there wasn't even Wi-Fi in the train.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
like the stations or underground,
Mhm.
and there were also no countdown clocks. And in my first couple of years, I loved digitizing the tape so much. Is you put in the tape, you put on your headphones, and you're hearing this like woman's voice or voices, depending. And it's so intimate.
Mhm.
And I've always been a voracious reader, but there is something completely different and much more familiar about hearing the story of a person in their own voice.
Yeah.
And it was in working on that project, that one day, like many of these tapes that they've labeled very like kind of scant, right? Like, and it's handwriting, like hastily scrawled, that they intend to go back and relabel it, but they may not have. I
Mhm.
put in this tape, and it would we have these events called at homes at the archives. It's like a salon, right? Like
Mhm.
lesbian community members come in or and talk about their work or whatever they're doing. And it was an at home with Paula Gunn Allen, who is Laguna Pueblo lesbian.
Mhm.
And I had heard of her work my entire life.
Mhm.
The Sacred Hoops, like I knew of her work, I hadn't really read it. Um, and there she was, her voice. And that recording for me was a huge catalyst of my whole life pivoting.
Mhm.
I suddenly saw for the very first time, and at this point, I'm like in my late, I think I was 29, 28 or 29. It was the first time I had ever heard the voice of a queer Pueblo woman who was
Mhm.
open. I mean, I knew I had, right? But
Mhm.
someone who like identified that way publicly. To
Right.
me, it was profound,
Mhm.
very profound. And to hear her using Curis, our language, like peppered in her poems, it shifted things for me so much.
Yeah.
And I started to think like, okay, I need to follow this. And it's calling to me that I need to integrate all aspects of my identity into my professional work.
Mhm.
And I believe I was still in grad school when that happened. Um, but I ended up going to ATOM the first
Mhm.
time I got a scholarship to go to ATOM. And just I remember it was in Oklahoma that year. It was 2012.
Right.
And just being like, whoa. But even then, I met one other openly queer person in that space, right?
Right.
And time kept going. I was, working in universities, one of my campuses. I put up a vitrine during like Native Heritage Month. So I was always like on that campus. I was always like I just left that university this spring. And sensed that like we had such a commitment on that campus to celebrate the identities and like as universities say heritage, right, of our student body, but we
Mhm.
hadn't done anything for Native students.
Mm.
And at this point in my life, like I'm in my 30s, right? And I'm just like, but those identities can overlap. Like we are, our student body is there with, it's still, predominantly Latin and Black.
Right.
And to me, it just seemed so obvious that like these Latin students are not non-indigenous. Why are we just pretending, not pretending, like it wasn't like that, it was like maliciously avoided. It was just kind of
Right.
like, oh, well, this like identity isn't part of our student body, so we'll just kind of like
Right. Right.
they just didn't do
Yeah.
anything. So like my
Mhm.
colleagues were in the library, fortunately, like got it 100%.
Right.
And we would put up vitrines.
Mm.
For Native Heritage Month, I would make little book displays whenever I could. I was in charge of the recreational reads program, so we did like a book card of just like books that in the campus community, faculty, staff, students could read for fun. I always made sure to like face out the Native books, and I would order so many.
Mhm.
Yeah, but then in spring 2019,
Mhm.
I got an email again through the campus lister from my grad school. It's like the alum email, and it was their new archives professor, Professor Thayer, and the horrible professor with the NAGPRA comment like had been
Mm.
let go. Um, but Professor Thayer had wrote and said that there's an organization called DOCIP, the Documentation Center of Indigenous Peoples, who are looking for volunteers to volunteer during the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues at the UN.
Mhm.
And I spoke to my chief librarian. I asked if I could take some vacation time to do it. And it was 4 weeks, and I received a stipend of, essentially volunteer work. But I live like I can see the UN from my window. But
Right. Right.
that time I lived at Queens, and being immersed for almost a month in this environment where it was these amazing advocates and activists from all over the world,
Mhm.
from indigenous communities on every continent, and working in this environment where I was doing so it was like the documentation center. What they do is they archive all of the statements of the delegates and the proceedings, and then I also worked in the technical secretariat room. So we would kind of mix it up and do different tasks. And in that room, people were helping delegates who would come, and like they would maybe need to photocopy their speeches before they read them in different sessions or breakout rooms. They needed help with computers, especially because for many of them, like they were almost all of them facile with computers, but weren't necessarily facile in English.
Right.
Right. And it was so fun for me as an English speaker, as someone native,
Mhm.
as a Russian and French speaker. I primarily worked with delegates who were Russian speakers.
Mhm.
And I had actually done a lot of independent coursework in undergrad about indigenous peoples in the Soviet Union and the way that settler colonialism um, affected what they call the small peoples. That's what they say. In Russia and Far East Russia and the Soviet Union. So it was so incredible for me to all of a sudden meet people who I had been reading about, and just be in this environment where they were just, leaving the UN at the end of the day. You see people in regalia or earrings or like all these like those little signifiers that indigenous people do to be like, hey, I'm here.
Right.
I'm not talking like wearing like full regalia to work, although that does
No. No.
happen, right? But that was appropriate in that environment, and getting to be on the floor in the UN, like my supervisor encouraged me to go up and sit in on several sessions in the I also went to many of the breakout sessions and took notes in both English and Russian, and it was an incredible experience for me.
Yeah.
I came in that space being like, something has to change.
Mhm.
Something in my professional life. This is so fulfilling. And not that I wasn't fulfilled at work. I love reference work. I love working with students. I love helping faculty to, all of it. I love all of that. But that space, it was such a profoundly invigorating experience for me, professionally and like internally. And I had for a little over a year pen pal that I met through the Native Pen Pal Project on Instagram. And I wrote to her. We'd been writing a bit over a year at that point, and I said, this is incredible. Like, what do you think I should do?
Mhm.
And she's like, oh, I have friends. I have two people I know, like a friend, family friend, Maria Hopfield, and then like another kind of like acquaintance who are part of this like new group for Indigenous women in New York. You should go. They've been meeting for a few months. And I went and I found my community and they're my family. And of course, we've been through some intense shit together.
Mhm.
We've been through a whole crisis where we had a member who's no longer part of our friend group, even, who was really insistent on like how we defined indigeneity. She didn't think folks who are reconnecting or unenrolled were native or indigenous. She just like didn't think it was appropriate for them to be in the spaces. And that was really hard to grapple with. I think especially because that individual saw me as someone, someone who's enrolled and someone who's like physically appears native. I think she assumed that I would immediately go to her side. But I think because I have had a lot of experiences not living away from home,
Right.
going to school in Wisconsin, living in New York City, living in Ukraine, and also very much because of my experiences learning from Ned about boarding schools and like all the reasons why people's identities are affected or why they become disconnected or partially disconnected, right? I did not agree with that.
Right.
And that community, after we went through that crisis, and that was only after I'd only been part of the group for a few months. And the next year we had the pandemic. We threw ourselves into mutual aid. And it was I was like, that time, as for all of us, it was a time of intense trauma. I was living in Jackson Heights, Queens, which was the epicenter of the epicenter. I often watched and still do the French news. And when the hospital a few blocks from my home was on the French news, talking about how like the pandemic in New York City was so bad that there's like this hospital that's using that has like ice cream trucks and morgue trucks parked outside because there's too many bodies to handle. And that's the hospital like very close to my home. And we met on Zoom. We met on Zoom very regularly, even though we'd all hung out regularly before then. But I think something crystallized in that time, in those years, where we really thought about like we all come from our home communities that are defined by our relationality, by our connection to each other. And we're living through a period when, like, by necessity for our physical health, we are very disconnected from one another. And then it was really beautiful how it actually made us more connected. We would just chat with each other, like we would talk about like obviously our mutual aid efforts and what to do, and and our like Instagram posts and teach-ins that everyone was doing on. But also we would and I remember like we made tobacco ties together. We just like everyone was like, okay. And one of us like had a partner who has a truck, and they drove to different people's houses and dropped off like the fabric and the tobacco and yeah, it was a beautiful time. A year into the pandemic, I ended my marriage. I started a new relationship, and then in spring of 2002, well, not even spring, February of 2022, we were very jarringly confronted with the fact that one of our members, one of our more outspoken members, was a race shifter, right? That they had been professing an identity that they didn't actually have. And I'm not going to call them a pretendian because they did have indigenous heritage, but the heritage that like an identity that they were using was not related to the one that they actually were raised in.
Right.
It was very intense. All of a sudden, we were receiving a lot of angry messaging and messages and like anonymous texts from people who were like, how come you're affiliated with this person? We didn't know.
You're right. You didn't.
So it was very jarring because we had been involved in mutual aid and redistributing money from donations to members, back to folks in the community, and we did an amazing job. I'm still really proud of that, but we had given that person money. They had gone, they'd gone to line 3. They'd been arrested. We gave them money to bail them out and support them in that time, not knowing that they weren't Native and that they were lying to us for years.
Right.
It was very painful. We had actually like disbanded in that time.
Mhm.
And the core group of people are still friends, but of course it was traumatic for all of us in different
Right.
ways. It was very painful.
Mhm.
And this is happening at the same time, the same week that the war in Ukraine began, war in Ukraine, which for me has been very disarming. I had family members there who became refugees. This summer of 22, one of the buildings from my high school was bombed.
Oh my God.
And trying to deal with that, the fact that I was like in the midst of a divorce, that
Mhm.
I'm like my partner lives in Canada, and it was and trying to like deal with the like border issues and like the frequent COVID testing to cross. And the first part of our relationship, the border was closed. And everything was just so disorienting. Trying to do my job remotely, it was just feeling so disconnected from everything, but also so profoundly affected by like my love for these indigenous queer folks. This
Right.
community, this group, the group was like primarily indigenous queer people. My
Mhm.
new relationship with my partner, who's also queer and indigenous, understanding myself through the lens of her family's experience, the fact starting to understand that my community is so fortunate that by whatever fluke, because we were already farmers, we're never removed from our homelands. Yes, they're greatly diminished. Yes, we live under this yoke of settler colonialism at every moment. But I don't understand what it's like to have a community that was displaced. I grew up in a community where we speak our language, and for most, not most, but for many, many people in our villages, Kiris, Tiwa, whatever their language is, it's their first language. And to witness my partner go to Zoom classes multiple times a week and like just arduously learning her language, a language that like there really aren't first speakers anymore.
Right.
And just it was and doing that in the midst of like a pandemic when we like had to be inside all the time. And also it was like a winter in Canada. Meanwhile, like this war is going on, and like someone that I trusted and had and believed in turns out
Yeah.
to have been lying about who they were. And in the midst of all of this, I decided, and I tend to self-sabotage myself professionally at that point. Like I just didn't think I was good enough. I would think about how like, Professor Deere didn't mean it this way, right? Well, like what she had said about working extra hard. I was like, I don't have it in me to work extra hard. I'm satisfied to just plot ahead with what I'm doing. I
Mhm.
actually don't mind what I'm doing. It
Mhm.
wasn't like what I was doing at the UN that I loved, but my partner encouraged me to apply for an NEH fellowship.
Mhm.
And I had already been doing some consulting with him because I spoke on a panel
Mhm.
with Jane Anderson. So my friend Nicole and I, we went to a beadwork workshop at the American Indian Community House, like the December before the pandemic started, and we sat by Emily Johnson, this brilliant UPIC
Mhm.
choreographer, and started chatting about archives. And I had actually like in grad school done I wanted to be a dance archivist, and I had done a couple practicums. I did one at New York City Ballet, and then at the Dance Notation Bureau, about how do we archive something that's ephemeral.
Right.
And Emily invited myself and Nicole to speak on this panel. It was put off for a year because of the pandemic.
Mhm.
And then we had this conversation with Jane, and I just felt like that time, it was so funny, like, because we have the recording, and I actually haven't listened to it since.
Okay. Yeah.
It's on YouTube, but like, I think because it was such and fomented so much for me.
Mhm.
Jane and I, emailed a bit after, and she asked me to apply because a national monument in Maine, Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument, was looking for Indigenous folks to work on their archives.
Mhm.
And at the time that, a year later after doing that, the fellowship came up, and I spoke to my colleagues on that project about applying for a fellowship to do oral histories with a team of people. I was by no means the only person
Right. Right.
for the fellowship, and I had a lot of support from the foundation, from Elliottsville Foundation, from the Wabanaki Confederacy, from the folks at National Parks, and I got the fellowship, and I was able to change my life because of it. I was able to support myself as I left a marriage. I had been with my former spouse for 18 years, and she's non-native. But having this fellowship, it gave me the funds that I needed to do what I wanted to do, which is to really incorporate my indigeneity and my queerness into my academic self, my professional self.
Right.
And also just having that financial support allowed me to just read, to really read through theory, to like immerse myself in how my own life path through these different places and languages and time and political situations, how they echo all of these previous generations of Indigenous memory keepers. Because we're primarily, we keep memories orally, or through our the ancestral objects that we create and continue to create, not necessarily through writing.
Right.
But that does not mean that our ways of knowing are any less valid. In fact, I think we have a more profound relationship to them because we have to engage with them differently than kind of like being like, oh, well, we have the book, right?
Right. Right.
And I think that just over the past couple of years, it's been critical to my understanding of myself and my profession. Now I'm working on 2 papers that I'm kind of fleshing out. I haven't started like writing the paper part yet. I'm still in the research phase. And I just feel completely reinvigorated professionally because of all of the things that have brought me up to this point. All these, like, all of these actors that I may not have realized at the time would become so influential, like Professor Deere. Finding that tape, listening to the tape of Polygon Allen, responding to an email to volunteer at the UN, and then going to that, realizing I need to find an Indigenous community, falling in love with my pen pal. Yeah.
It's amazing. I've been like, I was just almost kind of like entranced by your narrative and your ability to like talk about your experiences. And also congratulations on the grant and the fellowship. I know when we had connected on LinkedIn, I'd noted that in your bio, and I was actually a little intimidated to reach out to you because I was like, oh my God, this person is like in the big leagues, like
Even remotely true, but thank you.
it was so funny how I felt. So I just wanted to thank you for being so open and willing to work with me on this interview. And in the future, if you're interested, would you be open to another one? You would get another like another
Honor, thank you gift. Yeah,
yeah.
no,
Oh,
of
thank you.
course. But I think like I think it's really important. I think more and more and more about representation, and like what does representation really mean and who is it for? I really like reading Sims Bishop, just like this like concept of like the windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors in children's literature. That kids need the children's literature and media, right, to be windows into other worlds, but they also need them to be mirrors. And then they also need these sliding glass doors that are both, where they can imagine themselves in a different future, or as part of the world in a different way. And I think a lot of my public history work has so much to do with my professional identity, but not in a formal way. And that I've been, I started to really engage with American history as a 5-year-old through American Girl dolls. And I've been
Right.
Yeah, and I belong to many collecting communities, and my favorites are always the one that are willing to engage with like the nationalism and propaganda that is inherent in this brand of dolls. And I have an Instagram and I have 2 blogs. And I use my doll photography and I love traveling. I have like my favorite doll. I brought her all over the world. And I take photos of her, but then I use her as a way to teach myself, and then through social media, whoever happens to be out there looking, about the ways that settler colonialism has impacted not just Native people, but like everyone on Turtle Island and throughout the world.
Right.
I learned recently, like this fun fact from a buddy, that the most commonly celebrated holiday in the world is actually, and it's not the same, is independence from the British Empire.
Actually didn't know that.
Independence days, different countries and different indigenous nations' independence from colonialism is the most common. Like, I think like New Year is like the only one, you know, other more common. But I realized how my own personal history, like being raised by my like European settler descendant grandmother. When I was 7 years old, she gave me this gift of a little gray rabbit diary and some stationery, and that her encouragement to always engage in writing, that a daily practice of journaling is something that I would never regret as an adult, and it's true, I don't. And then the letter writing has been a way for me to connect with my indigeneity wherever I lived in the world. That I had these really strong, consistent relationships with my cousins and my friends from camp who were like from all over Turtle Island. And then joining, like one day, just like responding to an Instagram ad, linking up with a randomly paired pen pal whom I wrote to for over 3 years, and then one day fell in love with. And now she's my partner in the world. And our work affects each other. Like this dress I'm wearing is actually like a scan of her porcupine quill work, like made into fabric. And the way that having another indigenous person, just one person, just kind of affected so much about me. And then that she helped me find my community here in New York. Mm-hmm. And then that helps me connect to home and a different understanding of my sense of what home means in a different way. And I think that as library information museum professionals, isn't that what we do? Mm-hmm. Like, isn't that the whole point? Because if we're engaging in just being like these keepers of static memory, why? Right. I think my understanding of memory and of just being a human, an indigenous person, an indigenous person, it's ongoing. Mm-hmm. And of course, there's all, you know, like the 7 grandfathers' teachings or thinking about the 7th generation, you know, those can sometimes sound kind of kitschy at times because of the ways that they've been marketed to non-native people. Mm-hmm. But the reality is that this unending link over since time immemorial of our ways of being that have changed and adapted, and that we live in this post-apocalyptic settler colonial world, we still are very profoundly ourselves. And that kind of memory work, that's what drives me professionally, personally, that we have our sense of self. And that even when the aggressors towards our ways of being are from within our own community. I think about like the person in the group who was wanting to enforce her particular conception of what an indigenous person is, and then on the heels of that, 2 years later, someone who had this falsely portraying themselves as a part of a community that they had no affiliation with. Like all of these things are things that we interact with. But despite all of that, like we continue to maintain who we are. My partner and I have a daily practice we read every night, whether we're in the same city or not, that we read to each other for about 45 minutes to an hour every night. We just finished Mona Susan Power's A Council of Dolls. Mm. And I realized more and more and more that despite all of the archival material that I work with, the library material, and how incredible it is, fiction and storytelling is the heart of what I like to do. All of it, the way that all of these things interact. I don't think that compartmentalizing different aspects of our professions always serves us. Right. I think the way that we process trauma and indigeneity and queerness and all settler colonial effects on individuals, families, and communities, that writing fiction, that reading fiction, picture books, movies, all of it. Right. All of it helps us maintain our senses of self. And this idea that indigenous people are these vestigial beings that are just representative of this mythic past,
Right. Like long gone.
Right, like this, like the lone Indian on the horse riding off into the sunset. It's complete crap.
Mm.
Like just because we have like admixture with other communities, or because our faiths, our spiritual selves are not always like perfect replicas of what they were at the time of European contact.
Mhm.
I think I understand more and more and more and more in my adult life that we can never make any like real statement defining indigeneity. It's completely personal, but at the same time, essentially relational. And I think like having been forced within the past like 2 years to like understand more and more and more how other people try to define us. It's I think it does not necessarily matter what you look like. It does not mean that your connection is stronger because you have more genetic ancestry,
Right.
and vice versa. Sometimes a period like decades, centuries of traumatic experiences and being ripped from your home community can make that return so much more powerful and profound. And the other thing is just that we can never know any other person truly.
Right.
We have to trust in each other. Having trust broken is horrible. UW-Madison, my undergrad institution, a person was outed for falsely claiming indigeneity. It was very painful. I no longer live there, but even just being friends on social media with my community there, I wrote an open letter. I should send you that too. To my community there. Our understandings of ourselves shift, are in a constant state of change and flux throughout our lives and throughout seasons. And I think that's something that we need to understand about our families and our tribal communities, and our relationships with other indigenous communities throughout Turtle Island, throughout the settler states we live under, throughout the world. And all of that is part of just like we're working as an information professional, right?
Right. Right.
Whatever that means. How do we become responsible stewards of story, whatever that means in whatever context, and still honor ourselves as Native people, honor the Native people that we are in relationship with, and do the best that we can for every person, every patron, every client, reader that we come across. It is intensely complex, and there is no one way to do it. But I feel extremely fortunate to have had so many opportunities to learn from people, Native and non-Native, to help me understand what a way forward looks like for me, and how I can move through the world in a way that is a good way and not a manipulative way, not a virtue signaling way, not a way that is treating Indigenous peoples as just another resource in another extraction economy.
Mhm.
What are our individual and familial and community and broader responsibilities in doing work as an information professional? I
No,
think
I
I don't know, but
yeah.
I can't wait to continue learning more and more for the rest of my life.
Yeah, I just again wanted to thank you, and I do have to stop the recording here just for file
That's fine.
size for part
Did
1.
you have a minute? Yeah,
But
I think we got pretty far.
I was gonna say in the future, or probably when you're done traveling, I'm done traveling. If we could do part 2, that would be great because I'd love to ask you more questions and just learn from you because it's amazing to. I feel like you're kind of for at least for me one of the first people that has kind of really pioneered this kind of I don't know, just being really able to discuss the intersection of indigeneity, archives, libraries, all these things. So I just want to say thank you.
Thank
Um,
you. I think it's really it's absolutely it's so beautiful that you are collecting these stories, because I think when we have these experiences, when we go to ATOM or any of these big conference spaces, they're really profound, but they're also ephemeral.
right, right,
And I think that as an indigenous queer person, the most profound moments of growth and learning I have are one-on-one or very small groups, and being able to document that in whatever way we do. Because depends on the person and the relationships. Like it's really important work. Who knows? Like who knows who will interact with anything that we leave behind,
Right.
material or emotional.
Hmm.
We know how profound, like legacies of boarding schools are over
Yeah,
generations, and it seems immaterial, but
but it's
if we
not.
have, like, not at all, it's not even close to, not, and if we can do that even in ways that don't seem tangible, it's critical. That's how we survived, and that's how we will always survive, by never losing our senses of selves and never turning our back on like nurturing that in others.
Well, thank you so much again. I'm gonna click stop recording.
Right.